Thank you, everybody. Gather close so that I'm not shouting, and we will begin.
I'm going to tell you a story about a woman named Maggie Ramsay, who lived in the late 18th century. I've chosen her story because while I looked for the folk tales from the county of Lanarkshire in southern Scotland, I came across the story of a burn, that's a little river in Scottish, that's haunted by the ghost of a woman who was reputed to be a witch. But Maggie Ramsay in the late 18th century lived after the Witchcraft Act had been repealed in Scotland. It was repealed in 1736. Maggie Ramsay was still thought of as a witch by the locals. And I want to tell you her story.
She lived with her husband, Tam and Maggie Ramsay. And as far as we know, they were very ordinary people. But our story begins on one fateful Saturday afternoon. Tam and Maggie had been to Airdrie Fair. And after a very enjoyable day at the fair, they then went to the penny reels along the High Street, East High Street. And they'd spent all night in the penny reels dancing and wetting their whistles. And then they were going home together to Raw Yards, where they lived in a wee cottage. But Tam was a wee bit worse the wear for drink, and they ran into a press gang. Now, do you know what the press gang was? Back in the 18th century, the government paid big bruisers of men, big thugs, to wait outside taverns and pubs. And if they found men worse the wear for drink, they would just bang them over the head, throw them into the wagon, and that was you conscripted into the King's Navy. Against your will. That's how they got sailors back then. Well, Tam and Maggie ran into a press gang. And Tam, he'd had too much. He was too tipsy to run for it or put up a fight. So he was hauled into the back of the wagon. Maggie launched in at them. She screamed and she tried to thump the men, but somebody threatened her with an iron bar. One of the big chaps threatened her with an iron bar, and that was it. Maggie stood and she watched the van with Tam in it disappearing off down the high street.
Her world was shattered. Neighbours said that Maggie's behaviour changed from that day forward. They noticed that she was behaving more and more erratically. She seemed to spend much of her time on Airdrie Hill, walking up and down, scanning the horizon and muttering to herself, looking for Tam's ship to come back. But without Tam there to provide a living for her, Maggie had to do something to earn money. So she turned to what she knew best, and that was herbs and plants. Maggie became a spaewife.
So she started, innocently enough, making love potions. And it was youngsters that came to her. They wanted to know who they were going to marry. So Maggie would pick the honeysuckle, she would pick rose, verbena, tie them up in a wee sachet and sell them for just halfpennies. And the young folk, you would put that wee sachet under your pillow at night and you should dream of the person you loved.
Maggie also could read people's palms and tell people their fortunes. She read tea leaves in teacups. And her reputation as being a fortune teller went all the way from Airdrie to Glasgow, and people began to seek out Maggie for her psychic skills.
People were beginning to tittle-tattle and gossip about Maggie out under the moon picking herbs. There are some more lovely herbs growing along the burn, so we'll walk through the woods. But Maggie was so good at fortune telling that news spread wide and far, and people were coming from Glasgow to here, to New Monklands, to have their fortune told and their palms read by Maggie. And unfortunately for Maggie, the church got to hear about it. So the parish church, they served her a censure, a warning, that she was to stop her nefarious practices or there would be trouble. Maggie had to make a living. Her man was gone, So Maggie ignored the kirk and she carried on fortune telling, and she was very psychic apparently and very good at it. But the church then, because she'd ignored it, and they said lesser excommunication, Maggie Ramsay, and that meant that the parishioners were no longer allowed to consult or be seen to be friends with Maggie Ramsay.
How else was she to make a living? Well, there was one other thing she did, and she did well. She was an expert field worker. And during the harvest season, farmers came to Maggie to reap their fields. They ignored the lesser excommunication and they employed her on the quiet. Maggie began to get a bad name amongst the local people, as one incident sparked a flurry of gossip.
Now, there was supposed to be an occasion with a farmer called Rab Allen, and Rab Allen had been spent the day tilling his fields with Maggie and scything and stooking the work. And then he had a very bitter argument with her about how much he was paying her. And during the heated argument, he called her a second witch of Endor. Now, have you heard of the witch of Endor in the Bible? It was a name for a witch in the Bible.
Maggie replied that if he didn't watch his mouth, he would regret his words. Within a fortnight, Rab Allen had become ill, and then all of his family ill with a mysterious illness. One of his cows died, and his sheep alone, were worried by a mystery dog. The gossip spread like wildfire, and there was no doubt in people's minds that Maggie Ramsay was a witch.
So this is the area called Fiddle Naked. This was called Fiddle Naked in Maggie's day, and it apparently had been called that for a long time before. So people believed that witches gathered here on moonlit nights and danced to the devil himself playing the violin in the Fiddle Naked fields. So they had witches' dances all around the top of this very part of the hillside.
And as the gossip and the rumours spread, why, the devil began to make an appearance in the stories told about Maggie Ramsay. One of those stories was about a band of reapers, men from the Highlands who travelled the country at the harvest time looking for work.
It was that same farmer, Rab Allen, hired them, and he took them on the first night down to Walmain's pub for a brew and a wee dram. And one of the reapers was called Left-Handed Sandy, who was said to have the second sight. So he was a wee bit psychic and could see the future. And the more he drank, the more he boasted about being a champion reaper. And Rab Allen, never to miss a trick, said, he says, I've got a woman on the team here who could reap double anything you could in a day. And of course, young Left-Handed Sandy from the Highlands did not want the insult of being outdone by a woman. So he accepted the challenge, and the next day there was a reaping contest. Now, you saw the big field we walked past. They met in the morning, and they went to the centre of the farmer's biggest field, and there left-handed Sandy arrived and met none other than Maggie Ramsay, and they started back to back in the middle of the field, and then they worked their way outwards. So they'd got their hooks, their bill hooks for scything the barley. And after about an hour of back-breaking work, left-handed Sandy thought, I'll straighten up and see how my opponent is doing. So he stretched his back and he turned and he saw, to his amazement, Maggie Ramsay had managed to reap twice as much as he had in that time. But she'd not only harvested it, she'd stooked it as well. She'd tied it up into stooks. But then, even more surprising, left-handed Sandy saw that Maggie Ramsay wasn't alone. There was a man helping her. So, furious at being cheated, Sandy marched over and went, "Oi, that's not fair. What do you think you're doing?" But Maggie and the reaper, the man with her, just ignored him and kept going. So, furious, left-handed Sandy took his hook and he tapped the man on the sides of the legs, and the hook swished right through the legs, as if the man was not made of flesh and blood. And that silent reaper didn't react. He just kept going on with his work, Maggie stooking, him scything. Well, left-handed Sandy took his hook again and aimed carefully at the legs, and once more it swished right through the man. And then left-handed Sandy went again, watching carefully what he was doing, and as he went down to hit the stranger's legs, he saw that the man's legs ended in cloven hoofs. Sandy stood in horror. That was the devil helping this woman with her work in the field. So he ran back to the Highlanders to tell them, the devil's helping her, come and see with your own eyes. But of course, they laughed at him, and he managed to drag a couple over, but because they didn't have the second sight, they couldn't see the devil. They just saw a lone woman working away, stooking the work she'd done.
Left-handed Sandy left the Monklands district. He said he wanted to work in a more godly community. But the rumours about Maggie, they continued to escalate until, fortunately for Maggie, Tam Ramsay returned from sea.
He had lost half a leg, but he'd gained a small navy pension. And people said he made a fine dash. He had a navy reefer jacket with brass buttons and a gold-braided hat and his pin leg, and that earned him the name Captain. He was now known locally as Captain. But the heat was on with all the stories about Maggie being a witch and the devil working with her. So Tam got them a new cottage. They left Raw Yards and it was down the, Dunsyston Road. Now at this time, the late 1800s, Airdrie, the population was growing. The industries were growing. It was a boom town. So Maggie and Tam started a chicken business, poultry. They kept chickens for eggs, and every Saturday they would take a basket of eggs and plucked fowl to Airdrie Market. When they'd sold all their produce, they'd buy their messages. Then they'd go to Walmain's Inn on the way home for a wee dram before coming home. And apparently they'd walk hand in hand together, happy. They had a big black dog, Darky the dog, who would carry the basket with messages in his mouth home. And life was going well for the Ramsays. Until there was a huge storm hit the parish. In fact, it hit several of the parishes in the central belt of Scotland. This storm raged for a week and it caused havoc. When the people started clearing up the devastation after that week, they discovered that the Ramsay's cottage had been destroyed in the storm, and Tam Ramsay's corpse was found in the cottage. But Maggie Ramsay's body wasn't there.
Almost a week later, some wee boys who were going down the North Burn to guddle for fish saw a woman sitting on a huge boulder at the edge of the North Burn being guarded by a big black dog. The lads approached to get a better look, but the dog growled and barked at them ferociously, so they ran away, scared, back to their parents and told them what they'd seen. A search party was gathered. Oh, and even Pate Tamsin, the local minister from the kirk, he came with them for holy protection. When they got to the burn and the big stone, sure enough, there was a woman sitting there. The dog had gone, and when they got close, they saw that the woman was dead, and it was none other than the infamous Maggie Ramsay.
But it was Sunday, so they had to wait till the next day for the authorities to come and collect the body. And when they went, the dog and Maggie Ramsay's corpse were gone. There were a few strands of long grey hair attached to a sapling next to the rock. Nobody knew how Maggie Ramsay's corpse had got down to the North Burn, and they never knew where it disappeared to either.
From that day on, the rock at the North Burn was known as Maggie's Chair, or the Witch's Chair. And people believed that she'd put a curse on the burn and the rock, that anybody who misused the waters or mistreated the area would be severely punished. These rumours still exist to this day. In 1832, a local quarryman dynamited that huge boulder, Maggie's Chair, and he used the rock to make a road locally. Did anything bad happen to him? He drank himself to death. And even today, in 2022, it's still known to be a place haunted on misty mornings and moonlit nights by the ghost of a spae wife, Maggie Ramsay.